Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you powerful narratives of courage, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Today's story is one that will stir your emotions and inspire you, a tale of a woman who stood against abuse of power and refused to be silenced. As Madison's quiet evening turned into a nightmare, her determination to fight back ignited a movement for accountability and fairness. Stay with us as we uncover this gripping journey of strength and unity. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us on today's story and many more to come. Madison stepped out of the coffee shop into the crisp evening air, clutching her black handbag. She had spent the last hour catching up with her closest friends, a much-needed reprieve after an exhausting day at work. Her white dress swayed gently with her steps, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, contented smile. The city buzzed around her, but she felt peaceful in her little corner of the world. Her peace shattered when she noticed two police officers walking toward her. The older of the two, Scott Hudson, had an imposing build and a look of authority that seemed to pierce through her. His younger colleague, Jeremy Daniels, followed slightly behind, his face a mask of unease. Madison's heart quickened, but she reminded herself she had done nothing wrong. Surely, their approach was routine. "Good evening," Scott said, his tone clipped and formal. "We've received reports of a theft nearby. May we inspect your bag?" Madison blinked in surprise. "A theft? I'm sorry to hear that. But I've been at the coffee shop with friends. I don't know anything about it." Scott's expression didn't soften. He raised an eyebrow and gestured toward her bag. "Standard procedure. Hand it over." A flicker of irritation crossed Madison's face, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer, with all due respect, I don't think it's fair to inconvenience someone without cause. If you'd like, I'm happy to go to the station to clear this up." Scott's lips twisted into a smirk. "You think I need your permission?" Before Madison could respond, he reached out and snatched her bag. She gasped, stepping forward to grab it back. But Scott's grip was firm. He rifled through her belongings with little regard for her privacy, scattering items onto the pavement. "Hey, you have no right," she began, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. "Quiet," Scott snapped, his tone icy. He didn't even glance up at her. Jeremy shifted uncomfortably beside him, his hand twitching as though he wanted to intervene. But he said nothing. Madison's heart sank. It was clear she was on her own. When Scott finally tossed the bag back at her, his expression was one of disdain. "Nothing here," he muttered, almost as if he were disappointed. "But we still need to check further." Madison stepped back instinctively, clutching her bag to her chest. "What does that mean?" she asked warily. Scott didn't bother answering. Instead, he crouched and, to her horror, grabbed the hem of her dress, starting to lift it. Madison froze for a moment, then snapped into action, swatting his hands away. "No, you can't do this," she shouted, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathering nearby. An elderly man in a tweed jacket shook his head disapprovingly. "Cops these days," he muttered to his wife. "They think they're untouchable." Madison's face burned with humiliation, but she stood her ground. "Stop it," she yelled, tears stinging her eyes. "You're humiliating me. This is abuse of power." Scott straightened, his cold gaze locking onto hers. "Abuse of power," he sneered. "I'm just doing my job." Jeremy finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Scott, maybe that's enough." Scott turned to him, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. "You forget who's in charge here. Daniels. Keep quiet if you value your job." Madison's chest heaved as she struggled to control her emotions. The crowd around her whispered and stared but did nothing to intervene. Her tears threatened to fall, but she refused to let them. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and spoke through clenched teeth. "You'll pay for this." Scott chuckled. the sound devoid of humor. "Good luck with that," he said, turning his back on her. Madison stood frozen as the two officers walked away. The world around her blurred, and the chatter of onlookers faded into a dull roar. She had never felt so powerless, so stripped of dignity. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her dress, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. Her walk home was a blur, her thoughts consumed by the encounter. By the time she reached her small apartment, she felt like a shell of herself. Dropping her bag onto the kitchen table, she stared at her reflection in the window. Who was that woman? Trembling with rage and shame, the Madison she knew would never let this happen without a fight. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a call from David, her husband. The moment she answered, her voice broke. "David." Something awful happened. David listened in stunned silence as she recounted every painful detail. When she finished, his voice was firm, laced with anger. "Madison, we're not letting this go. That man needs to be held accountable." Madison took a deep breath, her tears finally subsiding. "I don't know if I can, David. He's a cop. Who's going to believe me?" "I will," David said. "And I'll help you every step of the way." For the first time that night, Madison felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know how they would do it, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let Scott Hudson get away with what he'd done. The next morning, Madison woke up with a sense of determination overshadowing her exhaustion. The events of the previous evening still replayed vividly in her mind, but she refused to let the humiliation consume her. Sitting at the kitchen table, she poured herself a cup of coffee and began to write everything down in a notebook. Every detail mattered: Scott's smirk, Jeremy's hesitation, the whispers of the crowd, and the crushing weight of her helplessness. David entered the kitchen, his brow furrowed with concern. "How are you feeling today?" Madison looked up from her notebook, her pen pausing mid-sentence. "Angry," she admitted. "But more than that, I feel like I have to do something. I can't let him think he can treat people this way." David nodded, sitting across from her. "I've been thinking too. We need to approach this carefully. What he did wasn't just unprofessional, it was illegal. There have to be other people he's done this to." Madison sighed. "Even if there are, how do we find them? People don't speak up against the police. They're scared." "We'll figure it out," David said. "But first, we need to report this. If nothing else, it starts a record. And I'll be with you the whole time." Later that day, they drove to the local precinct, Madison's anxiety mounting with every passing block. By the time they arrived, her palms were damp, and her breath came in shallow waves. David placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You've got this. Just tell the truth." Walking into the station was like stepping into the lion's den. The bustling room seemed to quiet as Madison approached the reception desk, where a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor sat. "I'd like to file a complaint," Madison said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The receptionist looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "What kind of complaint?" "About an officer," Madison replied, gripping her handbag tightly. "Scott Hudson." The receptionist's fingers froze over the keyboard for a brief moment before she nodded curtly. "Wait here." She disappeared behind a door, leaving Madison and David standing awkwardly in the crowded lobby. Minutes later, the door swung open, and to Madison's shock, Scott himself stepped out. His smug smile was back, curling his lips in a way that made her stomach churn. He strode toward her with an air of arrogance, his voice dripping with mockery. Well, look who's here." Madison's throat tightened, but she held her ground. "I'm here to file a complaint about your behavior." Scott chuckled, the sound infuriatingly dismissive. "A complaint? Against me? In my station? Bold of you." David stepped forward, his posture protective. "She has every right to report what happened. And you can't intimidate her into silence. Scott's eyes flicked to David, his expression darkening. I don't need to intimidate anyone. This is a waste of time. Complaints like this go nowhere. Madison clenched her fists, her voice trembling but resolute. Then I'll go somewhere else. I won't stop until you're held accountable. Scott's smirk faltered for just a moment before he shrugged and walked away. But Madison saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of power in the face of his arrogance. As they left the station, David turned to her, his jaw set with determination. His wrong. Madison. This isn't going nowhere. We'll make sure of it. Madison nodded, her resolve strengthening with every step. We will. The following morning, Madison awoke with renewed determination. The confrontation at the station had shaken her, but it also solidified her resolve. She couldn't let Scott's arrogance stop her. This was no longer just about her, it was about standing up to a system that allowed people like him to abuse their power. Sitting at her desk with a steaming mug of tea, Madison opened her laptop and began researching. She typed keywords like police misconduct and abuse of authority, diving into articles, forums, and social media threads. It didn't take long to find stories disturbingly similar to hers. Most were anonymous posts, describing humiliating encounters with officers who seemed untouchable. As she scrolled, one comment caught her attention: there's no point reporting. They protect their own. The words stung, but they also fueled her anger. Madison closed the laptop, grabbed her notebook, and began jotting down a plan. She wouldn't be silenced. If others were too afraid to come forward, she'd start by being the voice they needed. A message notification popped up on her phone. It was from Helen, her best friend, who had been her rock through many challenges. Helen, morning. How are you holding up? Let me know if you need anything. I'll be at the cafe if you want to talk. Madison smiled faintly. She texted back a quick reply and grabbed her coat, deciding that some fresh air and Helen's support would do her good. At the cafe, Helen was already seated by the window, her laptop open and a determined look on her face. When she saw Madison, her expression softened. Hey, you. How are you doing? Madison sat down with a sigh. Honestly, angry, frustrated, and determined. Helen grinned. Good. That's the Madison I know. I've been doing some digging on this Scott Hudson guy. You're not the first person he's pulled this kind of stunt on. Madison's eyes widened. What do you mean? Helen turned her laptop toward her. Look at this. She pointed to a forum thread where users shared encounters with police officers. Several posts described a tall, smug officer who used his badge as a weapon of intimidation. Though no names were mentioned, the details matched Scott's behavior perfectly. I've reached out to a couple of the people who posted these. Helen explained. One of them responded. Her name is Clara. She's willing to talk if you're up for it. Madison felt a surge of hope. I'm definitely up for it. Maybe if we gather enough stories, we can build a case. Helen nodded, her expression serious. That's the idea. But you have to be careful. People like Scott don't take kindly to being challenged. Later that afternoon, Madison and Helen met Clara at a quiet park. She was a soft-spoken woman in her early 30s, clutching a handbag as if it were a lifeline. Her voice trembled as she recounted her experience. He humiliated me in front of my children, Clara said, tears brimming in her eyes. I've been too scared to speak out. But if it means stopping him, I'll help. Madison placed a comforting hand on Clara's. You're not alone anymore. We'll fight this together. For the first time in days, Madison felt a sense of solidarity. The fight was just beginning. But now, she wasn't fighting alone. Over the next few days, Madison and Helen worked tirelessly to connect with others who had stories to share about Scott Hudson. Clara's courage inspired them, and they knew there had to be more victims willing to come forward. Madison's living room became their makeshift headquarters. Papers and laptops scattered across the coffee table as they pieced together a growing narrative of abuse and intimidation. Helen's investigative skills proved invaluable. She managed to track down an older man named Henry, who claimed to have had a run-in with Scott years ago. Henry agreed to meet them at a diner just outside the city. Madison and Helen arrived early, both nervous and hopeful about what they might learn. When Henry walked in, his weathered face and deliberate gait spoke of a life filled with hard work. He greeted them with a polite nod before sitting down across the table. "I almost didn't come," Henry admitted, his voice rough but steady. "But if this can help someone else, then it's worth it." Henry recounted how Scott had stopped him one evening on his way home from a night shift at the factory. The officer accused him of loitering and threatened to arrest him for resisting when Henry tried to explain that he was simply walking to his car. "He didn't care what I said," Henry continued, his expression grim. "It was all about showing me he had the power. He made me feel small, like I didn't matter." Helen took meticulous notes as Madison listened, her heart aching at the story. It was a pattern. Scott used his authority to demean and control, targeting those who were vulnerable. "Thank you, Henry," Madison said sincerely when he finished. "Your story is important. We're going to use every one of these accounts to make sure Scott is held accountable." Henry's lips curled into a faint smile. It's about time someone did. Back at Madison's apartment, they reviewed the growing file of testimonies. Clara's story, Henry's encounter, and the anonymous posts Helen had found painted a damning picture of Scott's behavior. The pieces were coming together, but they knew they needed more. "Have you thought about involving the media?" Helen asked as she typed on her laptop. "If we can get a journalist interested, it might put more pressure on the department." Madison hesitated. The idea of going public was daunting. She wasn't afraid for herself, but she worried about what it might mean for others involved. "Let's see if we can gather a few more testimonies first," she said. "Then we'll have a stronger case to present." Meanwhile, Scott continued his work as if nothing had happened. His arrogance blinded him to the storm brewing around him. He laughed off Madison's complaint at the station and dismissed the idea that she would actually follow through. But what Scott didn't realize was that his days of unchecked power were numbered. For the first time, he was facing people who wouldn't back down, and Madison was determined to ensure that justice would prevail. As Madison and Helen continued their efforts, word spread quietly within the community about their work against Scott Hudson. It wasn't long before more victims came forward, emboldened by the knowledge that they weren't alone. Each new testimony added another layer to the case, revealing a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, Helen received a call from a young woman named Jessica. Her voice trembled as she spoke, hesitant and unsure if sharing her story would make a difference. Madison and Helen arranged to meet her at a small cafe in town, eager to hear her out. Jessica was in her early 20s, her wide eyes betraying her lingering fear. She clutched a worn leather journal as if it were a shield against the world. After a few moments of nervous small talk, she began recounting her encounter with Scott Hudson. "It happened last year," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was walking home from my shift at the diner, and he pulled up in his squad car. He said I matched the description of someone they were looking for." She paused, her hands trembling as she opened the journal. Inside were notes she had written about the incident, a way to document the trauma that had haunted her ever since. "He searched my bag without asking and grabbed my wrist when I tried to pull away," Jessica continued, tears welling in her eyes. "It was humiliating. People were walking by, staring, but no one helped. When I told him I wanted to report his behavior, he just laughed and said no one would believe me." Madison reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Jessica's. "Thank you for sharing this," she said softly. "I know how hard it is, but your voice matters. You're helping us build something bigger than any one of us." Jessica nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. If you need me to testify, I'll do it." Later that evening, Madison and Helen met with Rose and her colleague, a sharp-eyed attorney named David. They laid out all the testimonies they had gathered, detailing each victim's encounter with Scott Hudson. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. "This is a strong case," David said as he flipped through the files. "But we need to ensure it's airtight before we present it to the department or take it public. If there are more witnesses, we should try to find them." Madison leaned forward, her resolve unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes. He's been getting away with this for too long, and it has to stop." As they left the meeting, Madison felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. The stories of Jessica, Clara, and Henry replayed in her mind, fueling her determination. Scott Hudson had underestimated the power of the people he had wronged, but they were ready to make sure he would never harm anyone else again. As the case against Scott Hudson gained momentum, Madison and Helen focused on strengthening their support network. They knew they needed more than testimonies to take on someone as entrenched in power as Hudson. Together with Rose and David, they mapped out the next steps, balancing careful preparation with the urgency of ensuring no more harm was done. One evening, Madison received an unexpected email. It was from an anonymous sender, simply signed "Concerned Officer." The message read, "I've seen what Hudson has done. I'm ashamed I haven't spoken out before, but I'm ready now. Let me know how I can help." Madison's heart raced as she showed the email to Helen. "This could be a game changer," she said. "If someone from within the department is willing to stand up, it'll make our case even stronger." Helen nodded, though her expression was cautious. "It's a risk for whoever this is. We need to be careful and make sure they feel protected." Madison replied to the email, asking for a safe place to meet. The response came quickly, a diner on the edge of town. Late at night, the meeting was set for the following evening. When Madison and Helen arrived at the diner, a man in his 40s was seated in the far corner, his back to the wall. He looked up nervously as they approached, his gaze scanning the room. "Are you Madison?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded and introduced Helen. "Thank you for reaching out. We know this isn't easy." The man, who introduced himself as Officer Rick Torres, leaned forward, his expression conflicted. "I've worked with Hudson for years. I've seen him use his badge to intimidate and humiliate people. But I always told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. Now, I can't ignore it anymore." Rick detailed incidents he had witnessed, Hudson targeting vulnerable individuals, abusing his authority, and silencing anyone who dared to question him. He spoke of the culture within the department, where speaking out against colleagues was seen as betrayal. "I've kept quiet because I was scared of losing my job, my pension, everything I've worked for," Rick admitted. "But after hearing about what you're doing, I realized staying silent makes me complicit. I don't want to be that person anymore." Madison placed a hand on Rick's arm, her voice steady. "Your courage means everything. What you're doing could make all the difference." Rick provided critical information, including times when Hudson had been reprimanded but faced no real consequences. He even agreed to testify anonymously if necessary. Before leaving, he handed Madison a folder. "These are internal reports I've kept copies of. They might help." As they drove home, Madison clutched the folder tightly, her determination growing. The pieces were coming together, and with Rick's insider knowledge, their case against Hudson felt more formidable than ever. The next morning, Rose and David reviewed Rick's information. "This is gold," David said, his eyes lighting up. "If we handle this right, Hudson won't stand a chance." Madison felt a surge of hope. For the first time, the idea of justice felt truly within reach. The courtroom was a stark, intimidating space. Madison sat in the front row, Helen beside her, while Rose and David prepped their materials at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Scott Hudson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But his eyes occasionally darted toward Madison with a flicker of disdain. The judge entered, and the room quieted as the trial began. David rose first, delivering a clear and impassioned opening statement. Your Honor, this case is about abuse of power. The defendant, Scott Hudson, has systematically used his position as a police officer to humiliate, harm, and intimidate individuals, believing himself untouchable because of his badge. Today, we will show not only the harm he inflicted upon Ms. Madison Carter but also the pattern of behavior that has long gone unchecked. Hudson's lawyer followed, attempting to paint Hudson as a dedicated officer who had simply made tough decisions in challenging circumstances. Madison clenched her hands under the table, resisting the urge to scoff aloud. The defense was playing to the audience, trying to frame Hudson as a victim of circumstance. The first witnesses were called, beginning with Marina. She walked to the stand with her head high but hands trembling. After swearing in, she recounted her encounter with Hudson, detailing how he had violated her dignity under the pretense of a search. The defense lawyer tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting her story lacked evidence. But Marina held firm. I may not have photos or video, she said, her voice cracking but determined. But I have the truth. I will never forget what he did. Next, Caroline took the stand. She spoke about the humiliation she endured in front of her co-workers and customers. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of the public shame she had suffered. I felt like less than a person, Caroline said. No one, especially someone in uniform, should have the right to treat another human being like that. When it was Clara's turn, the room fell silent as she described her fear and helplessness during Hudson's assault. He didn't see me as a mother, a person, just as an object he could dominate, she said, her voice quivering but resolute. Each testimony built on the last, weaving a damning narrative of Hudson's repeated abuse of power. The defense attempted to poke holes in their stories, but Rose and David were relentless in countering their arguments, ensuring the women's voices remained strong. Finally, Officer Rick Torres was called to testify. The tension in the room was palpable as Rick took the stand. He began by describing the internal culture of the department, laying bare the unspoken rules that had protected officers like Hudson for years. When you wear the badge, you're supposed to uphold the law, not use it as a shield for your own misdeeds, Rick said. Hudson crossed every line. I stayed silent for too long. But I can't ignore it anymore. Hudson's lawyer grilled Rick, suggesting his testimony was motivated by personal grievances. But Rick remained calm. I have nothing to gain by being here, he said firmly. I'm here because it's the right thing to do. As Rick stepped down, Madison felt a wave of gratitude. His testimony was the tipping point, a clear indication that even those within the system were no longer willing to protect Hudson. The day ended with the judge calling for a recess before final arguments. Madison left the courtroom with Helen and Rose, her heart pounding. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt the tide turning in their favor. The final day of the trial dawned with a mix of tension and determination in the air. Madison stood outside the courthouse, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. Helen held her hand, offering silent support, while Rose and David approached with their arms full of documents. Today was the culmination of weeks of preparation and years of anguish for those who had suffered at Scott Hudson's hands. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Journalists filled the gallery, their cameras and notepads poised to capture every detail. The judge called the court to order, and David rose to deliver the plaintiff's closing argument. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice strong but measured. This case is not just about one incident or one individual. It's about a system that allowed Officer Scott Hudson to believe he was above the law. Today, You've heard the stories of multiple victims, women whose dignity and rights were violated in ways no one should ever endure. This isn't about policy or procedure. It's about humanity. David paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Each of these women was silenced by fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed. But they are not silent anymore. They came forward with courage and conviction. The evidence is clear. And the testimonies are powerful. It is time to hold Scott Hudson accountable and send a message that no one, no matter their position, is above the law. The defense lawyer responded, attempting to cast doubt on the witness's credibility and portray Hudson as a victim of misinterpretation and exaggeration. But their arguments felt hollow against the mountain of evidence and emotional weight of the victims' testimonies. Finally, the judge turned to the jury for deliberation. The room was silent as the jury filed out, leaving everyone to wait in a charged stillness. Madison sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Helen leaned close and whispered, "No matter what happens, you've already changed so much." After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreperson rose, holding a piece of paper that held the verdict. The judge asked for the decision, and the foreperson cleared their throat. "We find the defendant, Scott Hudson, guilty of abuse of power and misconduct." A collective sigh of relief filled the room, followed by soft murmurs. Madison felt tears well up in her eyes. Helen hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it." The judge announced the sentencing, 5 years in prison and a permanent ban from law enforcement. The decision was met with quiet approval. A sense of justice finally served. As Hudson was led away in handcuffs, his expression was no longer one of arrogance but of defeat. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Outside the courthouse, Madison stood with Marina, Caroline, Clara, and Rick. The women hugged, their shared strength palpable. Rick nodded at Madison, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. "You've helped so many people today," he said. Madison smiled through her tears, her voice filled with resolve. "We all did." As the group disbanded, reporters surrounded Madison, asking for her thoughts. She spoke clearly, her voice steady. "This isn't just about one case. It's about ensuring that no one else suffers in silence. Justice isn't automatic, it requires action, courage, and unity." That evening, Madison and Alexander sat together, reflecting on the day. The battle had been long and grueling, but it was worth every moment. For the first time in weeks, Madison felt a sense of peace. She knew the road to true change was ongoing, but she was ready to walk it. This was more than a victory. It was a promise to herself, to others, and to the future that justice, though hard won, would always prevail. As the sun set over the courthouse, Madison stood with her head held high, surrounded by those who had supported her through the hardest battle of her life. Justice had been served, but the journey to ensure fairness and dignity for all was far from over. Madison knew that her courage had sparked something greater, a collective strength among those who had suffered in silence for too long. This story is a testament to resilience, the power of truth, and the impact of standing united against injustice. Madison's fight was not just for herself but for everyone who dreams of a world where justice prevails and power is held accountable. Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt story. If you found it inspiring, please like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories to stay updated with more empowering tales. Your support helps us continue to bring these meaningful narratives to life. See you in the next story.